I'm Kristóf György-Veres, International Director of the Danube Institute, and it's my honor and pleasure to open our event, A Struggle on Two Fronts, the Dual Efforts of Hungary and Texas to Stem Irregular Migration, a joint event organized by the Migration Research Institute and the Danube Institute. We don't do that many migration-related events here at the Danube Institute, so I'm pretty excited that after a long hiatus, we are going to have one again. Our speakers for today is Melissa Ford, a Senior Fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and Omar Saifo, Head of Research of the Migration Research Institute. So without further ado, I will yield the floor to our speakers and begin our event. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Omar Saifo, and I'm Head of Research at the Migration Research Institute. And I see a lot of familiar faces, both Hungarians and people who are residing in Hungary, who are, I'm sure, aware very much of the Hungarian migration policy and the debate with the European Union. However, I also see some fresh faces coming from abroad, so please let me provide an introduction on Hungary's migration politics, which evolved since 2015, the great migrant crisis in Europe. So recently, the European Union's top court just fined Hungary 200 million euros for, as they put it, not applying the European laws on migration. And every day when the payment is not paid, Hungary should pay 1 million euros extra. So this is only a new chapter in the ongoing debate between Hungary and Brussels, which started in 2015. However, the migration crisis, which reached its peak in 2015, started much earlier. In 2011, the so-called Arab Spring swept away governments who were partnering with Europe in keeping their own population, and also those who wanted to use their country as for transit to reach Europe. Therefore, Europe had no partners in these states, and also many of the North African, Middle Eastern, Sub-Saharan and Central Asian countries were already affected by the economic crisis of 2008. And also the effects of climate change, which crippled the local economies at that time. So migration already started to increase to Europe in 2013, but it certainly reached the peak at 2015, with almost 2 million people entering Europe, and almost 800,000 people choose the Western Balkan route, which meant that they entered Europe by crossing Hungary. It was a time of challenge, both economically, socially, and politically for Europe, and the European leaderships answered this question in a very different way. We saw that Angela Merkel declared the Willkommenskultur, declaring dass wir schaffen das, so we can make it, basically opening Germany's gates in front of the arrivals. However, Hungarian government took a very different perspective. So Prime Minister Viktor Orbán already warned on the dangers of migration in early 2015 at the time of the Charlie Hebdo attack, linking the failures of integration of previous wave of migrants and cheap labor, those arrived to Europe, and linking it with the new wave of migration. Meanwhile, in Western European countries where there were already millions of people having citizenship and basically having foreign background. This was a very politically problematic statement. However, in Hungary, the picture was very different, because, as you see, Hungary is, you cannot say it's homogeneous ethnically, because Hungarians are made up of people of very different background. There are people who have German background, Slavic background, even Turkish background, because of the old Ottoman times. But culturally speaking, Hungary can be considered as homogeneous, because it's mostly united by shared culture and shared language. And those who try to learn Hungarian probably know that it is very challenging to learn Hungarian. So once you learn Hungarian, you are integrated. So therefore, Hungary had a very different approach when it get to migration, and when the biggest numbers started to arise at the spring and summer of 2015, the Hungarian government chose to erect a fence at the southern borders shared with Serbia. It's a 175-kilometer fence, 4 meters tall. And the government was supported in doing so by the Hungarian population. It was, to put it that way, a political consensus in the necessity of this fence. Even those who were basically polling the opposition, the political opposition, more than 70% were supporting this fence. Therefore, we can put it that way, that there was a wide consensus in Hungary about the necessity of this fence, and basically this fence worked. So it stopped the biggest wave of migrants arriving. Certainly the fence did not do the wonder alone. It was also the European Union's agreement with Turkey in March 2016, which helped to stem migration somehow, because Turkey received huge funds from the EU, political support. Therefore, they were ready to withhold those who were already residing in Turkey, mostly people of Syrian background, Afghan background, and Iraqi background, to continue their way to Europe. Meanwhile, Hungary was also erecting a legal fence in the face of migration. So first of all, those who arrived to the borders of Hungary were not allowed to cross the country. They had to go to the so-called transit zones, which were like temporary camps, and they should file their request there. However, this was attacked by the European Union, stating that these transit zones are inhuman and they should be closed. There was another reason for attack, or other blames from the European side, that they said that Hungary's government are doing pushbacks on the border, meaning they are not allowing people to come to the country, and those who were already they managed to come to Hungary illegally, they were escorted back to the other side of the fence. Legally speaking, this was not pushback, because the border fence was not right on the border and still is not right on the Serbian-Hungarian border. It's 10 meters in Hungarian territories. So that's definitely true that illegal or clandestine migrants were escorted back to the other side of the fence, but still they were on Hungarian territory. So this, legally speaking, cannot be considered as a pushback. And still, recently we see an ongoing debate between Hungary and the European Union. To be honest, it seems that Hungary is winning this debate, because especially since the hybrid or the weaponization of migration by Russia and Belarus in the north, starting from 2021, there is a general agreement in the within the European elite that fences are needed, and fences can be a good service for the people. Thank you.
Thank you. And now moving on to the other side of the Atlantic. So Melissa, what's the situation in the US and in Texas specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Christoph, and thank you everyone for having me. Very new to Hungary, so everyone has been very welcoming, and I appreciate it. And just to give you a little bit of background, I'm currently Policy Director and Senior Fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and have been there for a couple of years. And prior to that, I worked at the Domestic Policy Council for the Trump White House. So as you can imagine, I'm very familiar with border security at this point. But what we are experiencing right now, especially in Texas, but not only in Texas, in the entire US, is completely unprecedented. And I hope that what I tell you will give you a little bit of hope that things could be much worse here. But we are experiencing the worst humanitarian crisis in the history of the US. And I understand a lot of people in Europe aren't familiar with how bad it's gotten or what the root of it is, and it's government malfunction. And I'll tell you a little bit about my work. I work a lot on US-Mexico relations at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And historically, we've had a good relationship with Mexico for the most part. We share similarly to you guys with a lot of your border neighbors. We share a heritage, we share a huge stretch of the border, and we share a culture. And so we want to have a good relationship with Mexico, but in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of threats emanating from Mexico into the United States, but especially Texas. And what has happened in the last couple of years since we had President Biden elected into office, I will give you some numbers just to show you how bad the situation has gotten. But the US does things a little bit differently, I think, than here. We count numbers and statistics in fiscal years. So we still don't have fiscal year 2024 because it ends in October, but I can tell you some of the information from the last fiscal year, which is 2023. It was the worst year for our borders ever in the history of the United States. We had over 2 million people come in, which is as bad as you were saying, that came into the European Union, but 2 million people that came in, and that is a fraction of what actually came in. Because unlike Hungary, our border is completely open and it is unsecure because we have a federal government that refuses to do anything about the humanitarian crisis at the border. And the 2 million people that came in, let me tell you, those are only the people that were stopped and apprehended. So that is the number of people that were asked, why are you here? Are you seeking asylum? And then they were released into the United States. And then we have 1.7 million who came in, which is what we call gotaways. We call them gotaways because we know that they came in. They were either caught on camera or we were able to detect them coming in one way or another. So we know that they came into the United States, but they weren't stopped, apprehended. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their intentions are, and we don't know why they're evading Border Patrol. And so the numbers are huge, and the worst part is that those numbers are not even, those don't include all of the people that came in undetected. And 100% of the activity that we have at the border is controlled by cartels, and they're very smart, they're very sophisticated, and they're highly organized. And so something that we've been seeing a lot in the last 3 years is that they will send a huge rush of people to one side of the border, which we have just Texas and Mexico. Our border is 1,200 miles long. I think that's like 2,000 kilometers. So it's huge. And one thing we saw recently, they called the crisis Little Haiti. They sent thousands of Haitians across the Rio Grande, which meant that pretty much all of our border patrol flocked there to try to deal with the crisis and apprehend them and process them. And then there was a huge stretch of border that was left completely open. And that is what they do. That's what they do. They use the smuggling of humans to smuggle drugs, and it's being felt in Texas communities. We have the highest level of crime right now, not just in Texas, but in the United States. We have an unreal amount of drugs and people dying due to drugs, overdoses, fentanyl. And we have a lot of social unrest because people in American communities no longer feel safe. Especially, we've done a lot of border trips in the south of Texas, and I can tell you that people are tired. Their property is constantly being broken into. There are fires set on their property. They deal with high-speed car chases of human smugglers all the time. And even our youth is starting to be recruited by cartels on social media. So that's a little bit of the background of what's happening in Texas. And let me tell you a little bit about what Texas is doing and how they're fighting back. Thankfully, we have a leader. We have Governor Greg Abbott, who has been amazing on this in trying to protect the state from what's happening at the border. And that's why I like to call Hungary kind of like the Lone Star State of the EU, because Texas is fighting back. And it has been for a very long time since President Biden took office. Because when President Biden took office, he not only didn't do anything about the border crisis, but he undid everything that was done under President Trump. Meaning that the border was open, there was an open invitation to the entire world to come in, and the results speak for themselves. In fiscal year 2023, we had 169 people on the terror watch list that were apprehended at the border. And that is more than the past 6 years combined. And that is from, just a small part of the border is actually tracked. A big part of the border is completely open. So we don't know how many of them got in. And so Texas has been doing everything in its power to protect the border, to put up some border infrastructure. You may have heard about some of the lawsuits that we're having with the federal government, but one of them is our Attorney General in Texas, Ken Paxton, last summer sued the Biden administration because a video came out of the Border Patrol cutting through barbed wire and fences to allow migrants to come into the US. So not just refusing to defend American citizens, but facilitating their entry into the United States. You could see 5 Border Patrol agents cutting through all of the barbed wire that Texas put there to defend itself and helping migrants up an embankment and lining them up to be processed so that they can come into the United States. So Texas sued the federal government because of that. And another measure that Texas recently took late last summer was they put in the buoy barriers, which some of you may have seen photos of. They're these like huge 3 meter by 3 meter, they look kind of like beach balls, and it's 100 feet of them in the middle of the Rio Grande to deter people from trying to cross the border. Because a lot of migrants die trying to cross the border when they're doing it illegally. Swimming across, crossing in the heat, they get dehydrated. And so this was an effort to make people go through the legal points of entry, through the bridges. And the Biden administration then in return sued Texas because they thought it was inhumane, is the word that they used. And they were very afraid that it would damage the diplomatic relationship with Mexico, who is not a partner of the United States, and they're not helping with the migrant crisis. So that's just a little bit of background of what's been going on. Texas fighting back against a federal government that just not only refuses to protect American citizens, but is not allowing states to protect themselves from the crisis at the border.
Thank you. So, if we understand it correctly, we have a Biden administration that believes in open borders, that doesn't believe in the fact that the United States actually has the right to stop anyone from coming in. And then you have Texas, the Lone Star State, who is trying to do anything in its power to protect its own borders. You mentioned 2 things. One was the federal government suing Texas because of the floating buoys, and the second one, the razor cutting. Are these just isolated incidences, or is there like a concerted effort from the Biden administration to stymie Texas's efforts?
The research that we have done at the Texas Public Policy Foundation shows that it's a partnership between Washington, D.C., the federal government, and the Biden administration, with actually the Mexican government, because they're both benefiting from a crisis. Mexico, as a lot of you may know, there's a lot of evidence of Mexico colluding with the cartels, of the government colluding with the cartels, and the reality is that the cartels are making more money than they have ever made, not just due to drugs, but due to human smuggling. And so Mexico has an interest in keeping the border crisis going. Not only that, but Mexico doesn't want to be a doormat to the rest of the world trying to come into the US. So they are facilitating entry into the US. So that's one thing. And then Washington, D.C., the federal government is, it's quite a case, but they seem to very much want to appease the Mexican government, and they don't want to give off this idea that they're anti-immigrant, which what we always say is that actually the opposite is
they're very good at appeasing actors.
Yes, they're very good at appeasing it. And what we always say that the most humane thing that you can do if you care about immigrants is close the border, because they're dying in record amounts. Our border, the Texas-Mexico border, was recently named the most dangerous land crossing in the world. We have human smuggling, we have kids and women being sold into sexual slavery.
I saw this video about a migrant complaining on the Mexican U.S. Mexican border to some TV crew saying, "Oh, look at all these people. I don't know who they are. This is not safe." Like an actual migrant who was trying to getting in. Is that real? Did you see that one?
I haven't seen it. I'll have to look at it. But to answer your question a little bit more, the issue of the federal government fighting state governments has a lot of history, and we can probably talk about it for hours. We won't, but there's always been the federal government versus state government and deciding which one will take precedent. The most recent Supreme Court ruling, which was Arizona versus U.S. in 2012, established that states cannot have their own immigration law, because at the time Arizona was dealing with a migrant crisis, and they decided to put in 3 different types of legislation. One, to make it a state crime for people to cross illegally, because believe it or not, it's not a state crime in most states. It's just a federal crime. So a state, the state of Texas, for example, if you cross the border, they can't do much about it. They can just defer to the federal government. And that's the way our government is set up, because we never imagined a time in history where we would have a federal government and a president that doesn't have our best interest at heart and doesn't want to protect American citizens. So states are not equipped to deal with a migrant crisis. And Arizona v. US was decided by the Supreme Court, and what was decided then is that states cannot have anything to do with immigration policy. They must defer to the federal government or they're breaking the law. And now Texas is trying to use the Constitution to fight back against that, saying that we understand that the federal government is responsible for keeping us safe and for keeping the humanitarian crisis at bay, but they're not. They're not doing that. They're not keeping our people safe. And they're using Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which says that if a state is being invaded, then it is allowed to defend itself. And with the current crisis at the border, which is it's not just migrants coming in, it is the cartels coming in and the cartels declaring war on Texas. We have more people dying in the US than ever before due to drugs. Fentanyl, this is a crazy statistic, but just since President Biden took office in January of 2021, we have had only in Texas with Operation Lone Star, which is what Governor Abbott of Texas implemented to try to help with the migrant crisis. He called it Operation Lone Star. And only in these years, Operation Lone Star has seized 502 million lethal doses of fentanyl. And what I mean by lethal doses is it will kill you. And our population, I think in the US right now, is like 340 million, 341 million. So what these numbers tell us is that that is enough lethal doses of fentanyl only in Texas that were seized to kill every single person in the US. Man, woman, and child. And we have more people dying every year. I think 2022 fiscal year was 107,000. It's more people than were killed in the entire Vietnam War or the worst year of World War II. And so if people are telling you that that's not a crisis, they're lying.
Well, at least you guys have an easy solution for that. You're having an election coming up. But my question is to Omar. Did the European election change anything here on the continent at the European level? Is there anything going to change in the European Parliament? Can we accept a shift in the attitude towards lawfare waged against Hungary when it comes to migration policies?
Well, speaking about the European elections and migration in general, there is this common migration program which is accepted by the European Union, and it is based on consensus.
So it was rammed through against the veto of right. Poland and Hungary, right?
Yeah, that's right. So once it's accepted, it's very hard to imagine that it's going to be renegotiated, because it was negotiated for so long. So it's a lot of investment in it, time-wise and energy-wise. What we see in Europe, we see that different organs approach the issue of migration on a very different level. So when it gets to the Council of the European Union, we see that it's made up of ministers who were elected by their population. Therefore, the discussions within the Council are more realistic and more practical than the discussions within the European Union, the European Parliament, which is mostly made up by people who are less accountable to the general population. So speaking about Europe in general, I can't really see that Europe will, as a whole, or the European Union as an institution, will solve migration and the migration crisis in Europe. What I see that it's not a brick wall which is built by the European Union, what we are seeing now getting higher and higher, but a wall made up of bricks, and each brick is put there by a nation state. And I see that the nation states are trying to close the gates somehow. And what we see that we saw, for example, Chancellor Scholz of Germany, who's a social democrat, having a much tougher statement on irregular migration than any conservative politicians before, not to mention Angela Merkel, who declared this Willkommenskultur. And we see, for example, in Denmark, that the socialist government as well implementing the toughest integration and toughest migration laws in Europe, which wasn't imaginable before. We saw in Italy in 2017 that it was Mario Minetti, basically also left-wing Minister of Interior, who used his previous Secret Service contact to negotiate with militias, not the government, because there was no government in Libya at that time, but with militias to hold the irregular boats back. So, and in generally speaking, we see Emmanuel Macron. There's a lot of criticism and rightful criticism towards Macron and migration politics, but still, he at least is trying to implement a tougher policies and legislation of migration than Jacques Chirac before, who was a conservative. So we see that elected politicians usually want to be re-elected. Therefore, they have to somehow answer to the demands of the people, especially at the times which we are witnessing in Europe, where the anti-migration parties are on the rise. In what used to be the Eastern Germany, we see that Alternativa für Deutschland is in the second place, and at some places they just basically won the elections. And we see, for example, the Swedish Democrats, once labeled as extreme right, are now basically in government. So I see that Europe is responding, and the European nation states are responding to this crisis, but still it's a long way for the European Union as such to respond.
So basically, the European countries are waking up, but we couldn't really say that the European Union as an entity is waking up from its slumber. We talked a lot about the Biden administration's open border policies, but is every Democrat an open borders Democrat? Is there some kind of spillover into other states? Do we see that in certain US states, Democrats say that this crisis has to stop? Is there a restrictionist shift?
Yes. Unfortunately, the crisis has gotten so bad that people are waking up to it. People that typically were very friendly to immigration, as are most Republicans. We're all very friendly to immigration. We want people to emigrate. I grew up in Bolivia. My family went to the US, but we did it the right way, right? And so what we always say is we just want people to come in the right way, not illegally. We don't want their first act in the country that they want to call home to be illegal. And so you're starting to see Democrats waking up because of the border crisis, because it's gotten to every single state in the United States. There's not a single state, even the northern states, that isn't facing the effects of the migration crisis. Drugs, crime, violence, all sorts of things are being faced. I've even had people that live up north send me pictures of like these huge migrant encampments. And so it's something that's being felt. And we're down in Texas. Obviously, we've been feeling it for a long time. But in the Texas Public Policy Foundation, in the recent year, we have had governors reach out from New Jersey, from New York, telling us like, hey, we're facing a fentanyl crisis. Like, we want to come and see the border. And so it's something that can no longer be ignored, and that people on both sides, from both parties, are starting to demand answers on. I kind of jumped ahead on your question when I was talking about the fentanyl, the amount of fentanyl that we have in the US. Truly, to put it into perspective, I don't think many people in the US...
The most important export product of China?
And that's a thing. You know, Mexico denies it. Mexico denies that they're sending any fentanyl. The president of Mexico says that it's not produced in Mexico. So there's a lot of denial going on. But I think now it's the main cause of death for people under 50 in the US. There's not a lot of people in the United States that don't know people that have died because of fentanyl. And it's not just drug users. I will say that a couple of months ago, we saw this mother testify in front of Congress. Her name was Rebecca, that they had bought her two sons, they were 12 and 14, had bought some like over-the-counter prescription pain pills. And they didn't know, obviously, but they died because they didn't know that the pills were laced with fentanyl.
This is from like an actual pharmacy.
Yes, and then obviously some of it is not. But there is a lot of drugs in the US that are laced with fentanyl. So kids are dying of it, teenagers, adults, all sorts of people are dying because of it. And so that's made all sorts of people from both ends of the aisle pay attention.
And these Democrats who you mentioned are waking up, where are they exactly? Because I talked to a Democrat member of the Arizona House of Representatives a couple of months ago, and she told me that in Arizona, the migration crisis is a non-issue for the election.
Wow. That's very tone deaf and out of touch, because I don't think in any city, in any state in the United States, you can deny that the effects of the humanitarian crisis at the border are getting to every single city.
So we talked about the fact that the cartels, you mentioned that the cartels control the border in the US. What's the situation on the Hungarian-Serbian border? Who is in control?
Well, the scales in our borders are luckily much lower. And I feel somehow ashamed to complain about the numbers here. But still, we are compared to the US, of course. But still, we are facing challenges. Since the border fence is there, because before the fence everybody could just walk into Hungary and cross to Europe. But since the fence is there, the border guards of Hungary are doing their best to protect this fence, which gives place for the smugglers we see now that different gangs from different countries of different background are forming their criminal groups and bringing people in illegally to Hungary. We have rivaling Moroccan gangs, we have rivaling Afghani gangs, and since 2021 there have been clashes between the rivaling gangs who are trying to control different parts of the border fence, setting up camps, and when they are sending a group of people to disturb and throw stones and anything basically, attack the guards to distract their view. Then they are sending at other places the group of actual migrants to cross the country. And the tension between the rivaling gang is quite high since 2022-23. Last year, there was a shooting which left 3 of the human traffickers dead. There were clashes between rivaling gangs, and there was an upcoming election in Serbia in December. Therefore, the Serbian government, which until that point, to be honest, didn't very much care about what's going on the northern border. They regarded people crossing to Hungary as part of the solution because they were under pressure from the south. They tried to protect their southern part of Serbia. Then they just basically left the northern parts uncontrolled. But before the election, then especially because of the complaint of the Hungarian government and other European governments, the Serbian authorities started to do their job. And they basically arrested lots of human traffickers and started to transport the people, the irregular migrants, back to the south of the country. So the situation now is a little bit calmer at the Hungarian borders as before. But in the latest year, we saw many crackdowns like this, and we cannot be sure that the Serbian authorities will continue doing their job once the political attention is shifted away.
So it seems that the Serbian army managed to crack down on the cartels. What about let's assume that a different kind of administration comes into power? What do you do with the cartels?
I think,
Assuming that they operate from Mexico.
right. So just to give a little bit of background on how the cartels control 100% of the border, there's not a single person that comes into the U.S. illegally that is not smuggled, and that's just the reality. We've heard it from people that have crossed. Our border patrol on the U.S. side of the border simply assumes whenever you see a woman or a child that they have been trafficked, that a lot of them have been assaulted, raped, abused. It is an assumption. Whenever we have someone cross over from Mexico,
They also assume that they are family, right?
That's another thing. That's why I say I think we could talk about this all day. They are so sophisticated and they are so evil. They have this program that everybody knows about because the Border Patrol has seen it happen, where you can pretty much rent a child on the Mexico side of the border so that you can use the child to come into the US, claim that they're your child. If you are a family or if you have a kid under 18, they're not allowed to deport you. They immediately process you and you are allowed into the US. And so what we're facing is just not just a border security issue, it's a legal issue as well. And so I think we'll have to see what happens if we have a new president that's elected. Unfortunately, it's a bit late. The crisis that we have in the US side of the border it's going to be very, very hard to combat, because the border has been open for so long that cartels have realized that this is something you can truly make a lot of money out of. For the first time in history, Mexico is seeing their different kinds of cartels fighting not only for territory, but for smuggling routes. So who can smuggle through what route and how they're going to make money off of that. And not only that, but they are very well established in American communities. So it's not just getting them across the border, but once they're across the border, getting them into other US cities. And so it's a problem that's unfortunately very deeply entrenched, and it's not going to be easy to fight with a new administration.
So Omar, you mentioned that up until the new pact on migration and asylum is implemented, the way to go forward is bilateral and multilateral cooperation by different member states, as well as third countries. Could we have one or two examples of that cooperation between European states?
Certainly, there are a lot of cooperation between European states, and it can reach very good goals very effectively. One case in point, for example, that Hungarian and Austrian government put a pressure on Serbian government together to ask for visas from people arriving from Tunisia. So until 2022, people of Tunisia were allowed to travel, take a plane basically without a visa to Belgrade. So the Western Balkan route emerged as a major route for clandestine migrants from Tunisia to cross to Europe, because basically they just traveled here risk-free and visa-free. But after the Hungarian and Austrian government started to put pressure on the Serbian government, they deleted this opportunity. So now Tunisians need to have visas to fly to Serbia. What we see now is a tendency of cooperation with non-European countries. Turkey is a major example where the agreement between Turkey and the European Union was signed in March 2016, and we see that the European countries are also signing their own agreement with different North African countries. still there is a problem that meanwhile the European countries are toughening on migration and making it harder for people to get asylum in Europe or have a permanent residency in Europe. They're still posing as a humanitarian superpower. And each time when restrictions are implemented in the media and in the social media, it is framed as it's an ease of legal migration. But when it gets to the potential migrants to Europe, they're basically extensive users of social media. And what they're seeing in social media are success stories from their compatriots who are already in Europe, posting pictures with fancy cars, fancy clothes, as they are living the European dream. And on the other hand, they are hearing this communication of the European member states and also the European Union that migration is a possibility. Of course, not this way, but anyway, and the human traffickers are also framing it in a way that it's easier to come to Europe. So, on the one hand, intended or not, the European countries are sending a letter of invitation for the potential clandestine migrants. On the other hand, the European countries are toughening on migration by legislation and also by signing contracts and agreements with transit countries of North Africa. And we see that Tunisia and Libya, Egypt, Morocco, even Turkey are under increasing pressure because of migrants. And we also hear from the news, which are, well, they are reported. Certainly there are no press presence in the Sahara regions. So it's only a small portion from the news which reaches the European audience. We hear that basically in recent months in Tunisia, hundreds, if not thousands of sub-Saharan African families were transported by the Tunisian authorities to the middle of the desert, basically, and left there without food and drink. We hear reports that the Turkish guards are basically firing live bullets on people at the borders. We hear similar practices from Algeria, and the European governments they don't really comment on this. So we see this big ignorance from Europe. So on one hand, they are sending an invitation letter, and on the other hand, they are okay with other people and other countries using violence against the people who are just trying to cross their countries.
Can there be any kind of cooperation between Texas and like-minded but not border states in the US?
There have been attempts. There was talk earlier this year during the legislative session about a border, they called it a border interstate compact. So basically taking all of the border states and being able to come up with its own form of border protection so that they can work together and share information and share technology to secure the border. Unfortunately, the problem with our border security, it's very different than Hungary. Because when we went to the border last week, something that surprised me is there is one entity, and it's your police, that is responsible for guarding the border and for making sure that there's no illegal activity coming in or threats coming in through the border. In the United States, that's a lot more dysfunctional, unfortunately. We have the Border Patrol, we have National Guard, we have police, we have military. Like there's a lot of many different components that are responsible for different aspects of protecting the border. So even though states have shared information and we have Operation Lone Star, we have a border patrol, a state border patrol that is trying to do everything in its power to secure the border. The problem is that under the current structure with the government, the federal government always takes precedent. So a video that we saw last summer that describes this very well is of a group of migrants coming in, being stopped by Border Patrol and apprehended, so being put away by Border Patrol behind a fence, and then you see the National Guard, Biden's people, walk up and open the fence and let them in for processing. And this is caught on camera, and there's a lot of cases like this. So the problem is that even if you have states working together to try to combat the problem, with the current way that it is structured, we need to come up with a different solution and put more options on the table, because maybe we get Trump in November and then the problem subsides for a couple more years, but what happens with the next president or the next president? The system isn't set up for states to be able to protect its own citizenry when a federal government chooses not to. And Texas is alone in the fight. It's got the biggest stretch of the border, 2,000 kilometers. It's huge. And so it's the entry point to the rest of the United States, and no state should be put in that position.
Thank you. I think at this point we should open up the questions to the audience. There is a gentleman in the background.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm a Hungarian historian, albeit I am dealing with the Ukrainian studies, and I'm a member of some committees at the Ukraine Academy in Kiev. Thus, my question concerns 2 points. The first, I'm very fond of the United States, where I have already been to several times and delivered lectures in 5 states of the US. To my great sorrow, I haven't been to Texas yet. So the first question concerns to the speech of Melissa, if I may, that's Ms. Ford, that Texas is a very rich country and a huge country, the states within the US. So how can you summarize that financial balance which put on the citizens, thus the local state budget and the federal budget, because it is a political and legal and moral question to debate about the problem of the immigrants, albeit I mean it's a financial question. And on one hand, I mean, if I were in Washington, albeit I'm not there, I could say that, okay, you are rich states. On the other hand, citizens of Texas are working hard for that. I respect their hard-working mentality. So, I mean, you can say something about this financial aspects of the immigrant questions. And as for the Middle East aspect. When Ukrainians emigrated from the war, they emigrated in a significant number, some people who were living there from Middle East countries because they studied there. So can you say something about that? Because Ukraine, as a former member of the Soviet Union and generally an East European country, accept a large number of students, for instance, at universities from the Third World War. And that's the fact that at that time there were citizens of African and Middle East countries.
So I think
what can you know about that?
So the first question is, I guess, how much it costs for Texas, and the second part of the question. What happens to third country nationals fleeing Ukraine when they reach the EU? That one is for Omar.
I think my one will be much shorter because I'm not an expert on Ukraine. So my honest answer is I don't know, because in the very beginning it was up to citizenship. So once a third country's citizen has a Ukrainian citizenship, he or she was accepted as a refugee. But to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what happened to those African, Indian and other students who also arrived to Hungary and crossed Hungary to reach other European destinations.
Well, I work on Ukraine, so then what happened to those people when you reach the Hungarian border from Ukraine, country at war? Hungary is the first safe country. Those people who have the right to enter the EU without a visa, they can just come through. They are registered as under the Temporary Protection Directive of the European Union, which has nothing to do with the TPS in the US. It's completely different. And those people who don't have the legal right to otherwise enter the EU, they don't have a passport or they don't have a visa, they are African students studying in Ukraine. I've met a few when I went to Ukraine after the war started. What happens to them is they come in, and then they have to be separately processed. And this is why Hungary and Poland, at the outset of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was accused of racism, because all those blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainians were just waved in, while the Middle Easterns and Africans were just sent to detainment centers. It is for their own protection. Why? Because first of all, we have to protect our borders. We don't know who those people are. They are let in because they are fleeing a country of war, but they have to be screened. They have to be screened. We have to know who they are. And also, they arrive in a vacuum. They come from Africa, and now they are fleeing to a third country from Ukraine. They have to be properly registered and then referred to their country's embassies and consulates in Hungary or in Poland, so that they can those consulates can take care of these citizens. However, Hungary offered, after the onset of the war, offered to students from a number of African countries to continue, who had a student visa in Ukraine, to continue their studies in Hungary.
I think my answer will be more simple. Texas is a state that has been very prosperous, and Texas has a lot of money from a lot of different things, including oil. And there's no denying that it has benefited a lot from the relationship with Mexico as well. With USMCA, that pretty much created a middle class in the south of Texas that were able to have different trade alliances with Mexican states. The problem is that Texas is paying for 100% of the defense at the border. People that live there, like me, are paying for Operation Lone Star because the federal government is not. And
More
there's
than $1 billion, right?
Yes, I think there's a tracker online about like how much we have spent by the day, but it's a massive, massive amount, and that's coming out of taxpayer pockets. And so I think that people are at the point where they are willing to sacrifice trade with Mexico. We've had a lot of conversations with people in Texas who say that until we have security, we don't want trade. They have to be linked. And that's what Donald Trump did, right? That's not what Biden is doing. He very much favors cooperation with Mexico on things like climate, but not on things like security. But what Trump did is, I'm going to give Mexico tariffs, or I'm going to punish Mexico if you don't cooperate with us on security. And they have the ability to. They just don't want to. And so I think we're at the point in Texas where people are ready to link trade and security. We don't care if we lose money while doing it, but we can't continue to live in the conditions that Texas has been under in the last 3 years.
Any other questions from the audience?
Sorry, is this just a comment really? Is this not going to be a bigger issue which more countries around the world will have to take seriously? I mean, personally, I think it's legitimate that you protect your borders. You have a right as a country or a nation for that.
Can you speak up a little bit?
But what I'm thinking about, I was reading something about Africa and the population increase in Central and Northern Africa. It's massive. You know, over the next 50 years, China population is stable, India population is stable, but the African countries are going to, I think, double or maybe treble. Were you familiar with that pressure, that there's an underlying force behind some of these issues?
Yes, certainly sub-Saharan Africa is one of the few regions of the world where the number of the population is increasing and dramatically increasing. Still, most of the migration is happening within a specific country or within a specific region, which also disturbs the existing social and economic systems of different regions. But we'll see that not that much people, or I would say a minority of those who are thinking to migrate are coming to Europe. Still, with European standards, this is quite a big number. And we shouldn't forget as well that there is the Sahara and there are the North African countries. So from Senegal or from other or any country of the Sahel region, it's quite a challenge and quite expensive to come to Europe. What we see recently is that migration became a business and a source of income. So very often the question is raised from where these poor people get the money. The answer is quite simple, that whole families are paying for one male member of the family to come to Europe, then to provide money for them by sending money back. And the problem is that the local governments are okay with it, because if the young males are abroad and sending money back, it means that the young males are not making political troubles and not posing political challenges for them. And it also means that the local communities who received money from Europe are okay and not going to rebel against the existing political order. So what we see recently, that from a European perspective, the role of these gatekeeping states, especially in North Africa, is increasing, and we see that Europe is putting principles away now. So in the time of the so-called Arab uprising, there was this enthusiasm and optimistic approach about democratization and liberties and nice things in North Africa. And after the experience with the rise of clandestine migrants from the North African countries and also sub-Saharans crossing to Europe, we see that optimism has faded away. So we see that Europe and European countries are willing to deal with the strongest political entity anywhere. So they don't care anymore about human rights in Egypt. They are very much happy with President Sisi doing the dirty job. And very similar in Tunisia, we see that Kais Saied at this moment is starting to be more authoritarian than President Ben Ali, who was toppled in 2011. But the EU is okay with him because he's holding power in his hands, and he's doing what he promises for Italy and France and the other European countries by holding the migrants back. So this is a tendency I see. So certainly you're right, there's a huge pressure within sub-Saharan Africa. But I see that the European countries are taking this into consideration, and more nasty things and horrible things are going to happen in the Sahel region, in the Sahara, very much away from the eyes of the sensitive European audience.
I think we have time for one final question. Monica Palotai from IWP at the back.
Hi guys, it's so nice to see you all here at the panel, and so lovely to hear all these opinions and expert opinions. My question would be, there are lots of people getting into the United States, unvetted, undocumented, with false documentation. It's obviously a national security liability and issue. My question is, what are the, and there's an additional layer, a geopolitical layer. With the Biden administration being so weak and being seen so weak all over the world, the number of foes are I don't even, it's countless, or it's growing. So what are the emerging or trending policy approaches to treat these people, or how to find actually them, how to find those people who are actually poses national security threat, or what is your opinion, or if you have heard about it or worked on any policy approaches that would tackle this issue? Thank you.
That's a very difficult question and a very good one, because in the United States there's a lot of laws in place making it very hard to deport people now, not just under the Biden administration, but in general. In a different state, in Texas, in Arizona, in any different state, you cannot stop people with no evidence and to ask them if they're there legally. It's just not possible. And so I think that's why it's so important to secure the border going forward. We know there is a lot of people on the terror watch list that have entered the US, and there have been attempts. We have seen attempts in different states, not just in Texas, of terrorist attacks. And honestly, I regret to say it, but it's probably a matter of time because of the huge influx of people that we've gotten, not just who have been released into the United States, but who we don't know are there, and people that the known gotaways, the numbers are gigantic. And so I think it's going to take an overhaul, a legal overhaul, likely something at the Supreme Court level, to where we can actually begin doing something about the problem. Trump has talked a little bit about that solution, maybe starting some deportations, but I think it's a very fine line because there are people that have been living in, and I understand, like your question about is immigration going to become a bigger problem? Yes, a lot of countries are struggling right now, and if I lived in some of these different countries in Africa, I would do the same thing. I would want to come to the United States.
I don't understand. It's so obvious that you would emigrate. Why not work for your country to bring up your country?
That's a good point.
That's what I would do. I'm shocked that it never arises.
Yes.
I leave because I'm greedy. I want to do good for myself. I don't care about my parents.
Well,
It's shocking.
I agree. I agree. And I think that three things need to happen.
Actually,
Of course you would emigrate.
actually, many people who emigrate do care about their parents, because the best way to care about your parents is by remittances. I mean, I think around 17 or 18% of Honduras's GDP is remittances from the United States of America, right?
Yes, and I will say, I think the reason that people immigrate is there's an open invitation to do so. People that are fleeing horrific violence in some countries, or people in places like Venezuela that don't have anything to eat, I understand why they emigrate. The problem is that there's an open invitation. Like you said too, you see people posting in the United States. When I was in Mexico and I went to a migrant camp, I talked to a couple of people that had come all the way from Venezuela. And they were like, I've seen some posts of my cousin who's in New York City. He has a job, he's working, and that's what we're after. And so I think that's a problem, communication campaign. Telling people that it's not what they think it is. It's incredibly dangerous to cross the border into the United States. So I think that needs to be addressed. Expensive, and a lot of people die doing it. So I think that needs to be addressed. And I think the last solution is people need to start demanding answers from their own governments. I think a lot of people look to the United States, especially in Latin America, to solve their problems. Come to the United States and everything will be fine, but no one looks to their own leaders to solve those problems.
Well, I think our time is up. I would like to thank again our esteemed speakers, Omar Saifo from the Migration Research Institute and Melissa Ford from the Texas Public Policy Foundation for joining us today. And I would like to also thank the audience for choosing to be here in such nice sunny day during the summer break. So thank you.
Thank you.